World Heroes, released in 1994 for the Sega Genesis courtesy of Sega's Midwest division, was the lowest cost, lower quality alternative for those who couldn't afford Neo Geo home arcade machines. And I'd imagine that's quite a significant number of people considering how expensive that stuff was. If you were one of the lucky few to own any semblance of Neo Geo hardware, and quite frankly it must really piss you folks off knowing all those wonderful games that you spent a couple $100 a pop back in the day on would eventually get bundled up and repackaged as PlayStation 2 compilation discs that people could buy for about $20. It also must suck that you have this pristine World Heroes game that is all kinds of awesome on your Neo Geo machine, and then you go to a buddy's house and all he has is a Sega Genesis and a version of World Heroes that quite frankly isn't up to snuff. Now, as an aside, the original World Heroes wasn't a remarkable game by any means. It was about as playable as any other fighter on the Neo Geo hardware, but other than a time travel gimmick that explains the origins of our heroes and a deathmatch option that isn't all that it's cracked up to be, it doesn't do anything that you couldn't do on any other half-decent Street Fighter II ripoff game at the time. But even setting that piece of business aside, the Mega Drive version of World Heroes is a half-baked endeavor, something that falls below the standard set by even the most mediocre of SF2 ripoff games. So let's start with the positives. All 8 fighters and 1 boss are included in this version of World Heroes, each one with their own set of special moves performed through the usual button joystick combination sequences. You have 4 skill settings to choose from, much like the Neo Geo original. World Heroes supports both the 3-button controller and the 6-button controller, with the former requiring you to tap buttons for light attacks and hold down for fierce attacks, while the latter gives you separate buttons for light and fierce punches and kicks, along with a couple throw buttons. After picking a fighter, the game gives you the option of either standard matches or you can compete in the death matches, where you compete in stages with either electric or flaming ropes or spiked walls that will harm anyone that crashes into them. This adds a bit of flavor to the game and also a bit of tension, as being stuck in a corner is the one thing you don't want to do in this situation especially. And for the most part, collision detection during the fighting portions is pretty solid. Unfortunately, everything beyond those bits falters quite a bit, starting with controls. Pulling off simple basic strikes with button mashing is one thing, but trying to pull off special moves, especially those requiring fireball motion quarter circle type things, sometimes it'll work, but most times it probably won't. Which is funny because these same inputs work well enough when played on other platforms. All I could say is that the simpler the input, the more likely the move will execute. Kind of an odd thing that the bread and butter of any fighting game, the special moves and the inputs required to execute said special moves, would be the least functional aspect of the game. Basically, the easier the special move, the more likely you are to execute it, which is why I spend my days playing as this Bruce Lee knockoff fellow. The overall presentation of World Heroes on the Mega Drive also feels a bit low rent. The heads-up display is very simplistic compared to other versions of World Heroes. There's no announcer or on-screen prompts for the beginning of rounds and fights, just a barely audible ding-ding after the characters do their opening poses. Game in general feels a bit slow-paced, giving the impression that these fights are taking place on the moon or something. The destructible elements of each stage have been omitted, which is a minor thing admittedly, but still. And then there are the endings, or lack thereof. Upon completing the game, instead of getting the traditional character-specific ending, you get a very generic ending of your character's statue while the credits roll. Tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. I'll give World Heroes some credit. It's a rather decent looking game as far as the in-game elements are concerned. The mugshots are decent, the fighters themselves are rather sizable characters with some mild details to them despite the lower color and frame count. The various stage arenas are somewhat varied, with a spaceship and an active elevator being among the various arenas you'll compete in. The deathmatch arenas are the only limited ones to the game. I only think there's only like a couple of them at most, but beyond that, it's okay looking. Nothing special really. Now, the Sega Genesis library comprises hundreds if not thousands of games, and a good chunk of those games have some high-quality musical pieces that pushes the Mega Drive sound processing processors to its absolute limits. World Heroes is not one of those games. While you get a soundtrack that somewhat mimics that of the source material, it is not what one would consider high-quality music, regardless of whether you thought World Heroes had good music to begin with. Sound effects are kinda lame, and the few voice bites that made the cut sound so rough and so dirty that it's hard to understand what they're saying. Overall, World Heroes for Sega Genesis is below average fare. It's light on features, light on presentation, and quite frankly light on playability as well. It's not a completely worthless game though, and as a mindless button mashing session among friends, it's fun for a lark at most. Still, if you like the World Heroes games, you may as well just stick with the Neo Geo versions, whether it be the originals, home or arcade hardware, or the various re-releases from over the years. This version on the Mega Drive doesn't quite cut it, and that's rather unfortunate.